Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here, and it's a delight to be in the last session, as I'm sure you'll all agree. I think this is a really important discussion that we're having at present, and I agree with the statements by Isabel that it is a question of democracy. It's a question of how and under what circumstances we organise our life, who is involved and why, what is the outcome and where are we going. And it seems to me that the question of institutional experimentation raises these issues in a very stark and immediate form. I'm going to talk about and reflect on some comments and make some observations, and I'm also going to take you through a case which hopefully illustrates some of the issues involved, and then draw a conclusion. And the starting point, of course, is the sorts of issues and concerns that Glenn raised with you in terms of organisational activity, in terms of institutional concerns, in terms of experimentation, and how these come together, and how, if we focus as scholars, as researchers, and indeed as activists, how we can begin to make sense of some of these issues in the way that we want. One of the things that happened in the conference over the last 2 days is that the challenge of us setting criteria and developing an understanding of institutional experimentation is quite stark and quite difficult. We've got all sorts of different ways of looking at these terms, partly because of our own scholastic disciplines and so forth. In the session that I went to yesterday on the aeronautic industry, a session that did wrestle with the issue of institutional experimentation in 5 extremely important and relevant papers, Tony Edwards made a comment at the end which was very important, and that is we're talking about an industry, the aeronautics industry, which is based on technological innovation. If it wasn't based on technological innovation, we'd still be flying around in biplanes or whatever. It's an industry that rests on technological innovation, and we talked in the seminars about that. And the question that we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we talk about institutional experimentation in the context of an industry in which innovation is absolutely central and critical? So what distinguishes for us the experimentation? What is the criteria that we use? How do we go forward? And what do we understand by institutionalization? That web of rules and norms that enhance our understanding of particular sorts of social relationships and so forth. So we have definitional problems. We have those concerns. I do not want to argue for one definition. We come from different traditions, different understandings, different forms of engagement. So we're going to have ways in which we connect, but we do need a body of common understandings. We need to be able to say, in terms of our reports and our cases, this is the criteria which we're using. On the basis of that criteria, we can actually begin to compare. We can begin to unravel and understand and draw out general understandings and general concerns. And then we can make some sort of sense of the engaging presentation by Peter Turnbull around the 2 Dennis the Menaces. And we've got to obviously make a decision in the process as to which one we actually wanted to subscribe to. And so we've got a puzzle, and I want to argue that in order to develop the notion of institutional experimentation, we have to start with a puzzle. We have to start with a problem. We're not starting with the mundane. We're not starting with this is how we've always done it. We have a particular social and material set of problems created in a world in which we're under planetary threat, in the context of a world in which our agency is actually challenged politically and socially on a daily basis. So how do we select something out, and what is the problem and puzzle that we need to address? So I want us to ask ourselves, well, who is involved? Who are the actors that are participating? What forms of governance and regulation apply and we should be engaged with? What is the ecosystem that we're involved in? As John Peters reminded us in one of the plenaries, how does this actually locate in terms of a world that's actually under material threat? How do we engage with people to understand and develop our understandings about these particular problems? And what are the conditions of sustainability? What are the conditions of sustainability in the world in which we live? And all of you should thank Charlotte Yates for that particular term, since I gave her a draft of the paper and she said, "Oh, very interesting, Peter, but as usual, you've forgotten the most essential point." Namely, how can we create a sustainable and humane future. We have a long friendship, and she stands behind my shoulders, sometimes on the left, more recently on the right. Well, she is a provost, for you that don't know. I'm just a jobbing academic. So let me take you through a case. Let me take you through a set of events. Now, those black and white things there, they're what we call cows. From these cows, we get our milk and our butter and our various other things. Now, behind that is an electricity generator, a coal-fired electricity generator, a generator that was owned by Energy and a generator that was closed 2 years ago because it didn't actually fit the multinational corporate model. They didn't do it for particularly good reasons. They didn't say, look, world, we're actually concerned about what we're doing and how we're polluting. Of course, many of you will know, and let me remind you, that Australia stands on a per head of population basis as the first or the second most pollutant nation in the world because of this, because of mining lignite, mining brown coal, pumping it into the generators and pumping it out, as well as a lot of other activities. Now, if you look at this region where this is based, all the political debate is about those generators. We don't actually have a debate about those poor old cows. Now, this is a region which is actually a food bowl. It is one of 2 or 3 major food bowl centres in the context of Australia today. And yet we don't debate it. Those cows and their counterparts as beef, whatever they are, beasts, horticulture, etc., they constitute half the gross domestic product of this region, and we don't debate it. We don't consider it. What we do, are we concerned about, and quite rightly, about the things behind, but we don't debate it in terms of what is the future of the population in that region. We talk about, and so how do we actually map out the proposals, the concerns to actually recognise and develop this region in that sustainable and humane way in which I initially referred to. So, how do we begin to go about that? And I'm just going to give you some of the clues, some of the ideas that I and others are actually playing around with as we look at the changes that are taking place. Like Glenn Morgan, I am taken with the arguments about a foundational economy. Arguments that says if we look at a regional economy, we have to distinguish between those resources, those capacities that are embedded within the region. And we need to think of those in relation to most of the social and economic development policies which look for a solution outside, look for foreign direct investment of one sort or another, look for the multinational coming in to rescue our population in terms of work and employment. And what the Manchester scholars are doing is asking us to think of how can we distinguish the economy in this way. And if those of you haven't read this material, Google Manchester capitalism, and not only will Karl Marx come up, but a few other more modern theorists will emerge, Carol Williams, Julie Froud, etc. What do we know about this region and this food? We know almost nothing about it. The data is collected in forms that are not shareable. The data on some of these things, some of these areas like horticulture, doesn't actually exist. We don't know how many people work within this area, are employed within this area. We don't know the contribution of these food sectors in terms of the local economy, in terms of the regional economy, etc., etc. They're the sorts of things, sorts of issues that we need to actually learn about. And we have a region which suffers a very inchoate form of regional governance for forms of activity. And we have dominant narratives within that area which are challenging and questionable. So what is the experiment? The experiment that is taking place in this area is that the state government of the region has invested in the region because it's an area of long-term decline, limited educational opportunities, limited employment opportunities, limited work opportunities, and since the 1990s has been going on that downward trajectory. So it's an area of political concern, it's an area of social and material concern. So how do we, so in that context, are investing within the region and are setting up a high-tech precinct. The high-tech precinct, well-funded within the area, has as its starting point food and fibre. And what we're doing, what other people, what the state government is doing, what the stakeholders within the area is doing, is trying to identify how and that industry and that concern can take place. The starting point is for us to reconceptualise how we understand food and fibre. Politically, administratively, and bureaucratically, we make distinctions between agriculture, that sort of activity before the farm gate, and we forget about what goes on after the farm gate. This is a region which has a big manufacturing base to it. In that manufacturing base, it's basically food processes. And you can't understand the engagement, on the one hand, of manufacturing with the engagement of agriculture per se. So what we need to do is reconceptualise what we mean by this particular sector. And in that sense, we have begun to reconceptualise value chains, work out the efficacy of the chain, work out where value is added, at what stages on the chain, and more importantly, who captures that value. And believe me, the people who capture the value are not in the region. They're the supermarkets, they're these sorts of organisations and activity. And that's really just to give you a brief contrast with some of the developments that are taking place, some of the developments that are beginning to unravel that. That particular beef firm there, small company, transports its own goods, etc., is the first carbon neutral farm in the state of Victoria, the province of Victoria in Australia. A carbon neutrality achievement that took place 2 years ago. And the bottom one is a garlic producing area. That's emerging as an industry. It's 3 to 4 years in place. We know nothing about it. The garlic farmers are struggling to work out what they do. They don't know when to plant the garlic to get the best return. They are struggling with terms of workers, etc., seasonal workers, transport workers, etc., etc. These are the sorts of issues that we need to unravel and explore. So why an institutional experimentation? Because we're looking at a particular area of activity, we're taking it forward step by step, we're reconceptualising the value chains, we're laying the foundation for political and economic intervention to create the basis of a vibrant, sustainable and humane industry. And that leads me to the final point that I want to make, is that I think we need a set of criteria in which we pose these issues as a problem, as a puzzle. We look at the ways in which in deliberative ways, objectives are worked out. We look and study and understand the patterns of intervention in terms of reviewing, and then we review and reset, as Glenn was suggesting in terms of the evaluation. My final point is this is a debate which all of us need to be involved in within the international partnership, the CRIMT partnership. We need to explore and be open-minded in terms of understanding that many of us will have different ways of actually cutting the cheese, and we need to then encourage debate amongst ourselves and then from ourselves to the rest of the world. Thank you.